empathetic joy, that rejoicing becomes frivolous or meaningless rejoicing. Then the antidote to that is to reflect on loving kindness, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So that the rejoicing is rejoicing about something meaningful, not frivolous or even harmful. So these are the four immeasurables, and these are the four close near enemies that, and how to overcome them. So any questions about that?
I think that life is sometimes much more complicated.
More complicated?
And especially if we deal with the psyche. I mean, we can be cruel to people we love, that we have attachment to, and I mean, also, I mean, this kind of walking is kind of walking on on the cognitive side, and not I don't know how to explain what I mentioned, but
So what's the question?
the question is that everything seems so simple in what you said, and I think that life is much more complicated, and there are also a defensive mechanism, and you can think that you I mean, you can be cruel in your mind, but not really. I mean, things are much more distorted, especially when we deal with mental illness and personality disorder. I mean, it's not just okay. Let's do this repair, this look at that and that, look, and try to fill everything with positive light, and everything will be good.
So, of course, if we want to deal with certain things in life, we need to put those things in a way which we can easily understand, and then have some effective mechanism to work with that. So I think it's important to have some clear framework of understanding life and our mind and so forth. Otherwise it's just a big mess. We have no way of good understanding of the processes and so forth. So of course in Buddhism is one of many systems of understanding, and so in Buddhism there's a very well thought out system of understanding the mind and the functioning of the mind, and in terms of the mental afflictions and then the positive qualities and so forth. And so based on that way of understanding, then we can put forward very clear methods to deal with various things in our life. So this is just one approach to doing that. I think one of the things that is certainly very important in the Buddhist approach is that in dealing with mental afflictions and so forth, it's very important to understand what is the source of those mental afflictions, and then not only work directly with the mental affliction, but also work at cutting the underlying source of those mental afflictions. And so I think this is where in Buddhism, of course, we talk a lot about the vipassana practice, the wisdom practice. Because the Buddha's assertion is that all of our mental afflictions at the deepest level are coming from a distorted view of reality. So therefore, the long-term strategy across the board with all mental afflictions is to cut the underlying root cause, the fundamental ignorance, and that is through the vipassana practice. But of course, we also want to have effective short-term strategies to deal with things directly. And so some of these things are how to directly deal with some of the mental afflictions so that at least we can reduce them. Now, of course, all of these approaches here within Buddhism are assuming that we have some level of mental health that we can start to implement these ideas, particularly through meditation and integration in our life. So if we are below that level of mental health, then I think it's difficult to implement some of these strategies like shamatha, vipassana and so forth. Very difficult. So therefore, I think that what I see happening, and that's a very good thing, is that a lot of the modern therapies we see in psychology and so forth are now drawing on some of the ideas in Buddhism, such as mindfulness, to put together therapies that are more and more effective in dealing with those very heavy mental issues and bringing the person up to a better level of mental health. And then from that level, then we can really start to effectively use these tools here. So I think therefore that work is very, very important to bridge the gap, because I think in some sense, to simplify things a bit, we could say that sort of the job of, like in psychology, is to make an unhealthy ego healthy. And in Buddhism, we're sort of starting with a relatively healthy ego, and we're trying to transcend the ego altogether. So I think they really complement each other, and I think there's a lot of good work being done in the last 5, 10, 15 years in that middle area, that sort of grey area, and to help people to move through the whole spectrum. So in the Buddhist teachings, you won't really see anything about how to deal with psychosis and how to deal with bipolar disorder and so forth, because these practices are assuming that sort of minimum level of mental health, that we can start to do things from our own basis. So I think there's a sort of a good work together there between those different systems. The best. And the thing we need to remember, and this is where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, is when we start to talk about love and compassion for the difficult people, I think it's basically because we're doing this cognitive fusion all the time. And then when we're saying, to, as you said, to bring that love and compassion to difficult people, then people misinterpret that to mean somehow then, oh, what you're saying is that you're condoning their behavior, that what they're doing is sort of okay. But that's what it seems like if we do cognitive fusion and someone says that to us. That's sort of the interpretation we often get. And then often people think, well, no, that's not right. And in fact, then that loving kindness and compassion is a sign of weakness. But again, it's really, I think, it's really coming from this cognitive fusion. And if we can just drop that and have a correct perspective, then, as you said, is if we can really spread that loving kindness and compassion to everyone, then the world will be a much better place.
I was thinking about the same thing. I was thinking about my parents. I love them dearly, but they drive me insane.
Sure.
So how, like, this all seems very nice on the board, but then when it comes to real life,
Yeah.
even if I understand their intentions are the best and I love them, how do I change my behavior around them?
Yeah, okay. A lot to be said there. One thing, of course, and this is something I'll probably mention briefly tomorrow afternoon, is, you know, I talked briefly about long-term strategy, short-term strategy. You know, long-term strategy is to overcome our mental afflictions and ignorance and so forth. Short-term strategy is that, part of that is, if there are certain things or people that whenever we encounter them, we're always overwhelmed in a negative way, always, then maybe it's not good to unnecessarily put ourselves into that situation, because we're just getting overwhelmed and maybe we're causing suffering for others and certainly for ourselves. So therefore, and unfortunately often these people are family. So we're not talking about abandoning them, but maybe physically giving yourself a little bit of space from them in the short term. Of course, running away is never a long-term solution, but give yourself a little bit of space in the short term while you're working on your own mind, developing your own mind, so that then later you can be more and more present with them and not be overwhelmed, and then hopefully be even a positive influence on them. Because now, if we react, they react, we react, and it just gets worse. The relationship just gets worse. Whereas if we step back a bit, in a practical way of course, and then we're working on ourselves and reducing our reactivity, improving loving kindness, compassion, then when we come into their situation and they sort of push our button or trigger us, we won't react as much, we'll stay calm and we'll respond in a better way. And then hopefully that will be a positive influence on them, and then the relationship will improve. So that can be a short-term strategy. One more point on that is, you know, we're talking here about loving kindness and compassion, but always with that, in our behavior, we have to bring in wisdom. They always have to come together. Otherwise, we end up all sorts of trouble. So, and in any given situation, there is no book you can go to that says, do this. Every situation is unique, so we have to evaluate every situation on its own merit, and then using as much compassion as we have, as much wisdom as we have, together, we respond. And sometimes that wisdom may say, this situation is too overwhelming, I need to back out of here. That may be our response. You know, for example, if someone's in a bit of a rage, wisdom might say, whatever I say, it's just like throwing petrol on the fire. I better step back here and let them blow off a bit of steam and calm down, then I'll say something. So that could be the response. But that's all we can do in any given situation. Use as much compassion, as much wisdom as we've got, and we respond. Now, of course, sometimes we don't respond in a very good way, but then we learn from that. And then next time, we know not to do that. That didn't work. Let's try something different. And don't beat ourselves up about that. So that's all we can do. If we do that, that's all we can do. No one can ask more of us than that.
So about parents, isn't the model of love between a child and his parent is based on attachment, not psychological attachment? I mean, they give us things in order to survive and develop, and all we do is develop and think when we're growing up. I mean, that's basically attachment.
Yeah, right. And if a parent, and of course as a young child, we're very easily influenced by others in our environment. So in the early years of childhood, it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for, a very critical time that we educate those children in a good way. And if we don't, and we do things as a parent to increase that child's attachment, oof, watch out. Watch out. It's going to be a very difficult relationship. So therefore, if we can interact in a way which is encouraging and loving kindness to, from the side of the child to the parent and not attachment, that's going to be much better. The child is going to develop in a much more healthy way, and the relationship between the parent and child will be much better. So this, remember, I understand your point. Remember, anger is not a certain display. Anger is a mental attitude. Anger is wanting to hurt them. So therefore, exactly, so therefore, with compassion, wisdom may say, to get through to this person, I need to use some very strong language and maybe even some strong physical things to get through to them. So that's wisdom. That's not anger. So that's what we need to do. That's why it has to come with compassion. Otherwise, if that person's misbehaving and then we come and go, oh, please don't do that. I don't like that. I mean, maybe the person goes, Whereas we understand if we use more forceful language, we'll get through to them in a good way. That's wisdom. That's not anger. So we can, outwardly, it could appear that we're very angry, but actually we're just using very strong words to get through to them. And I think if we inwardly have this compassion for them, and even if we're using very strong language, and of course not cognitive fusion, not directing at them, but directing at behavior, and we have that compassion behind that forceful way of behaving, I think the person, unless they're completely out of control, if they can sort of sense that. They can sense that we're not attacking them directly, that we're actually attacking their behavior, and then they may respond better.
I have another question.
Sure.
I've been thinking about the setup for the retreat.
Sure.
Because of something personal that happened
Sure.
before the retreat.
Sure.
And I've been doing like all the work, like separating the person from the action, all the meditations, and it's working. Like
Sure.
when I'm sitting, it's working, but then when I'm not in the meditation,
Sure.
it's like twice as strong.
Sure.
And
Sure.
it's not something I know, like it's not a habit of mine I know from before. But it's like I feel like the more work I do, the more it consumes my mind, and I feel like physically,
Yeah.
like
And it's
hurting
what,
my
yeah,
voice.
yeah, that's right. So what's probably happening is it's a very difficult situation, and we are trying to see it in a better way, but we're still getting caught up in it. We're still getting caught up in it. So then we say, okay, this seems like it's something too big for me now to work with in a good way. So let's step back a little bit and not jump into it, because we're learning some new ways of looking at things, but our ability to do that is not so strong. So if we try and apply this new way of looking at things to really big things, what's probably going to happen is we're not going to be able to do that, and then we're just going to, because we're focusing on it, so we're just going to get more and more reactive. So if we notice that, then we need to just step back and go, okay, I can see that I still need to do a lot of work on improving my way of looking at this. So for now, I'll just sort of back off of that, and then I'll keep working with smaller things that I can transform or look in a new way. And slowly over time, maybe later, then we can come to that, and we can transform the way of looking at that. So if we're trying to do this and it's really becoming bigger, it's a sign that we're not ready to be able to do that. And all that's happening is we're just getting caught up in our normal reactive habit. Then the strategy, of course, is back out.
There are situations in life where you can't back out. Like, I go back to work, on Sunday, and I have to deal with everything about, don't talk to me for 2 weeks until I figure this out.
No, it's not a matter of that. But I'm saying is, of course, what I'm talking about is situations where we don't want to unnecessarily put ourselves in situations that overwhelm us. Of course, if we're confronted with the situation and we can't back out, then we just try and do the best we can. And at least in those situations, the one thing we can do is just, think a little bit before we open the mouth, sort of thing. The normal sort of approach. Don't just blurt out something. Just stop a bit, take a few breaths, and think about it before saying something. Yes, and of course, we may, of course, still be reacting because we're not there. But that's, we're just trying to do the best we can. That's all we can do. We can't do more than that. Okay, last question, then we need a break.
So if you were talking right now about intention, actually, about
Intention.
our inner intention, our intention can be very compassionate, but our outer
Display can look very strong. Yeah. And so, actually, when we look in Buddhism, in Buddhism, you don't really talk about emotions, because emotions is the outward display. What's important is what's underlying those. And that's where, we talk, sometimes this, what I use the word mental afflictions, if the word in Sanskrit is klesha, it means something that agitates mind. Sometimes people translate that as disturbing emotions. But technically, a lot of these things are not emotions, because it's what's underlying the emotion. That's what's important. Again, the verbal and physical display is not the important thing. It's what's driving that. What's underneath that is what we need to pay attention to. Okay, let's take a break. Come back at 3:30.